the Zoom thing before I set up my work from home space because I have the big window behind me that I have to keep closed all the time. And you can't see any books. This room actually has a lot of books, but you wouldn't know it.
I attempt to be upstairs to show books, but I obviously need to put in a fiber.
The Zoom thing before I
Okay. So I'm going to let the people in and I'll hand it over to Timon immediately then. Okay. Are you ready?
Thank you.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay.
I like watching the numbers.
Okay, yeah, I think we can start. Okay, well, welcome everyone at this American Book Center event, an evening with Megan Rosenbloom, author of Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. Megan will be in conversation with Alison Devers. Well, welcome, Megan and Alison. Very glad to have you here. My name is Timon Zwaan, and I'm a bookseller at the American Book Center Amsterdam. I'm so glad you could all make it to this event. I'm really excited about this because as a bookseller, well, piles and piles of books go through my hands every day. And when I first picked up a copy of Dark Archives, this one, by the way, I just knew how to read it immediately. It was so fascinating. And the history of books bound in human skin is utterly fascinating. And Megan sheds a light into a part of history that is often shrouded in mystery and misconceptions. So for one thing, human skins books is not a Nazi thing, and its origins are surprisingly woven together with the start of modern medicine in the 19th century. But above all, what struck me about the book is the way the stories of the known and sometimes unknown persons whose skins were used for these objects are brought into the light, and in such a way it partially undoes the well, literally objectification that happened to their bodies after that. So in that regard, I think this is an important book, not just because it is a fascinating subject, but it also makes you think about, well, life, death, the role of modern medicine, and the way we treat and should treat the remains of those who passed away. So once again, very excited to host this event tonight. Megan will be in conversation with Alison Devers. A little bit about Megan Rosenbloom. Megan is collection strategies librarian at UCLA Library in Los Angeles and served as a medical librarian for many years. She is the co-founder and director of the Deaf Saloon, the event arm of the Order of the Good Deaf, and the proponent of the Deaf Positive movement. She leads a research team called the, and I hope I pronounce it correctly, the Anthropodermic Book Project that aims to find the historic and scientific truths behind the world's alleged books bound in human skin, or anthropodermic bibliophily. Okay, I tried to pronounce it right, but and of course the author of Dark Archives, which is about this practice. Alison Devers is a writer, art journalist and critic, and rare books dealer based in London. Her first book, Train Object Lessons, is forthcoming from Bloomsbury in 2022. She just told me that it's almost finished. And she's the owner of The Second Shelf, a bookshop of rare books, modern first editions, and rediscovered works by women. And I can really recommend, after this event, of course, to browse the Second Shelf website, because it's a very nice website to browse and very, very interesting books. Okay, well, quick note, the paperback of Dark Archives will be released next month and can be pre-ordered via our website at abc.nl. During the event, well, Megan and Alison will be in conversation, and we'll talk about lots and lots of topics about this book. But if you have any questions for Megan, please feel free to type it in the chat. After Megan and Alison have concluded their conversation, Alison will pick a few from the chat to, well, let Megan answer them. So I think I've said enough. So without further ado, I would like to give the stage to Megan and Alison. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
It's really great to be here. I am so excited to do this talk because I've been excited about this book since it arrived in proof copy at the Second Shelf. And because I've known Megan for a few years now, we live far away from each other, so we haven't gotten to meet too often, but I consider her a friend and a colleague and an inspiration. We have lots of common interests, both of us working in different areas of the rare book field. And I'm just really excited to learn more about this book. I read the book right when I got it, which was last year. And then I have been spending the last few days revisiting my reading of it and thinking about the things that I'm really interested in talking about. And I think because the topic of human skin can cause such a reaction immediately from anyone who would come across such a topic, including myself, I think it would be really nice to start actually before we get into that subject with, I would just like to hear a little bit about Megan's background in rare books and her love of rare material. Megan, I was wondering if you could tell me if you have a memory or a favorite of or a moment where all of a sudden you realized that like rare books were a passion for you, and when that happened.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, it's funny because I don't think anyone's ever really asked me about that part. So I really appreciate it, because it is the love of rare books that started me on the path of this whole thing. And it was that area that kind of drove the rest of it. So I think that, I was always a library kid. I used to walk really far to go to the library when I was a little kid. I just always was into books and would read as much as I could and everything like that. But in terms of realizing how rare books were special, and sort of really going from someone who might go to a museum and looking at art, but then maybe your eyes just gloss over the books that are on display, to being the person who, hones in on the books on display more than anything else. I think that kind of started around the time that I was starting in library school. And the one thing that I remember really vividly was that I just wanted to kind of get to know the inner workings of libraries better, and in particular rare books. And I went to visit the Philadelphia Free Library's rare book room. And I mean, I had been going to that library since I was in high school. I would, take the train to go there and everything. And I had no idea that they had this rare book room and that they had all of these amazing artifacts in it. And I got a little tour, and they had, besides books, they also had some really interesting artifacts, like
and I know what you're gonna say.
Yeah, a taxidermied raven that was Charles Dickens' pet, which is purportedly the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven, is in Philadelphia for some reason. And the person giving me the tour did things like took out a rare book and then moved the I don't even know how to describe it, but moved the book in such a way so that you could see that there was a painting, the 4-edge painting on the side. Is like a magic trick almost, where it looks like a regular gilded book. You move it slightly, and then you could see the Philadelphia skyline, colonial Philadelphia skyline from the from the east to the west. And then if you flip the book over and did it the other way, you would see it from the west to the east. And I was just mind blown about, okay, I've always loved the content of the books, I've always loved history, and then kind of really realizing that there is so much in the materiality of books that makes them, it adds a whole other level of interest for me. And that was really kind of the moment that I can think of that really sort of opened up that for me. And then when I became a docent at the Rosenbach Museum, that was just like, I was gone after that.
I'm obsessed with the Rosenbach because of their reading chairs. I mean, there's lots to be obsessed with, but I have this fascination of I want to recreate one of those perfect chairs for my life. They have a reading chair that has an ability to put a it's like there were no laptops then, but somehow they've designed a perfect workstation for now in their reading chairs. Anyway, that's two amazing places, the Free Library and the Rosenbach. I like the idea of you seeing this 4-edge painting on the book, because people, I think those are some of the most TikToked and viral sort of book secrets that books hold, but they're a really good representation of like, sometimes we don't understand what things are hidden in a book or what histories are hidden in a book. I remember even like, I was a rare book dealer for like 2 years before I realized, oh my gosh, how do I make sure I don't miss a forage painting hiding, and like had to go and went and asked the community, like, how do you tell if you're not looking for a forage painting, how to see one if you're not, if you have no idea, because there have to be forage painting books that have gotten away without people realizing it. And apparently there's a shimmer to the edges of the pages of some sort, a silvery shimmer that like gives it away in the light that reflects differently. So
yeah,
now,
I feel like it's the same thing with human skin books. There have to be human skin books that have gotten just lost track of.
Yeah.
There have to be. Because if pretty much one of the only things that tells you that something may be a human skin book is someone wrote inside of it at some point bound in human skin. If they didn't do that, then, you know, they look just like any other book on the shelf and you could very easily not notice one. And so I think while there are a lot of books that people have falsely written, you know, whether intentionally or just by, you know, in a good faith effort, but being actually wrong, while there are plenty that have that, you know, appellation in there that turn out not to be real, I really do think that there are probably more that just, you know, someone got made, knew what it was in their, it didn't have to write it down because it was theirs. And then, you know, they die, their whole library goes to their relatives, they just break it up or throw it out or whatever.
maybe it's not even something, it seems like based on the examples in your book, and we'll get into some of them as we chat, but there's like kind of, I mean, there's probably many reasons people did this, but two of the main ones is for a personal project or personal meaning. And then the ones that actually end up being more like questionable or fraudulent are ones where they have questionable intent to be salacious or to be, I mean, all of it might have questionable intent, I suppose. If you don't have a really good provenance and story behind the book, it would be difficult to know what people's intent was unless you really had like a first-hand account of the intention, which I don't think you have much of. But so with that in mind, so I do think like one of the things that's really interesting about this is like, you probably get a lot of the same types of questions, I'm sure, including myself. I'm very guilty of being like, oh gosh, she's going to be like, this book is going to be full of books that were bound in skin by Nazis. And I just thought we could take the space, and it was mentioned, Tiemann mentioned it, that it's not actually, you do cover Nazi Germany and things bound in skin, but that is not actually what you found to be the case. And I thought you mentioned it.
Yeah. So I think I try to unpack in the chapter about Nazi Germany, which for a lot of reasons was the most difficult chapter to write, because I wanted to make sure that I got it as right as I possibly could, while also knowing that you can never like definitively say there was no thing ever, right? So I had to be like, as of this time, we have not found any even alleged Nazi skin books, you know, haven't even found one that was actually said to be from that era at that time. Since then, one has come up where it's sort of tangential, potentially from it. It's not really a book, it's like a photo album, which is like kind of a book and kind of not a book. And, you know, there's been testing, but it's not the same testing that we have. So we're still kind of looking into whether, like, what the situation is with that individual book. And I've gotten, you know, emails, even one recently where it said, oh, did you hear about this account of someone saying that this book existed? I don't know where it is. I don't know, you know, how to track it down. Those kind of things that, I mean, a lot of the problem, it's like, I really appreciate when people give me tips like that, for sure. But there is also a limit to how far you can trace down every thread. Like at some point, you know, the trail goes cold in a certain way and you can never really know. So all that all that caveat aside, in general, these books were made in the 19th century, usually in America and Europe. And they were very often made by doctors, often doctor book collectors. There was a real doctor bibliophile kind of community that existed for a long time. I mean, to the point where I'm the president of an organization that used to be just like a doctor bibliophile society in Southern California. So there was it was seen as a social good for doctors to be book collectors. And so doctors had access to this bookbinding material that no one else did. And this was in a time before our modern ideas of bodily consent. And actually, the aftermath of World War II helped cement what our modern ideas of bodily consent are. Before that, there weren't really laws around that kind of thing or anything like that, or expectations, and people wouldn't really conceive of it in that fashion. Also during World War II, the idea of rebinding books and, the object of the book being like an individual unique book that you would, do things like rebinding, it really was starting to majorly fall out of fashion, where it was way more popular to do in like the late 19th, early 20th century. And so I kind of go through that chapter trying to unpack why we have these very strong associations that when we hear book bound in human skin, we immediately say that must be a Nazi thing. And
and it's really great to clarify sort of what's known and not known. And I thought one of the things that's really interesting about this topic is it is so specific, right? You're looking at something that seems like it would be incredibly narrow in focus. But what I really appreciate about this book is actually, as a person newer to the rare book trade, you actually, because of your digging through centuries of book history in search of where these books are, which are hard to find or almost mythological in area, or have built narratives around them that can't be totally untangled, that you get a really good sense of the history of whole decades and eras of the rare book trade, and also a sort of really good understanding, or like you get a good insight into what goes into binding a book at a tannery. And so in a way, it's like, despite being so specific, we're learning a lot in trying to zoom in on that, about what it is about rare books and collecting. So to me, that was a real highlight of the book. And I think one thing that came up for me is that you do mention sort of, there's something interesting going on with the idea of skin and bookbinding, human skin, because it's so specific, but also like the idea of skin as a covering and superficiality, and the way book collectors behave. And this is a big fascination for me as a woman rare book dealer. I have certain opinions about how sort of like, as a broad category, the trade has been dominated by men, and they've tended to favor books by men, not all the time, but typically. And the way that they collect maybe even be somewhat gendered, because sometimes it's about pristine copies and books having jackets and not being touched. And there's a superficiality sometimes, that's the word I keep thinking of, to this idea of how a book is held and used, that somehow to me really came through in how you process this information, about like, oh, the reason the collector is so interested in these things would lend themselves to possibly want books to be bound, these men to bind books in a rare material that only they have access to. It's like, it's a collecting behavior. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that and sort of how it all works, how it all came to be.
Yeah, I think that the collector's mindset is really kind of on display here, right? Because, and I didn't really get like that specific in the text of the book, but what I've discovered is, to the extent that there is provenance on some of these books about who bought it, like not necessarily who created the book, sometimes that's available and sometimes that's not, but then it also tends to pass through the hands of collectors before it ends up in a public institution like a library or museum. And some of those people, those book collector people, say this book collector collects unusual bindings of any kind. So this is a very unusual binding, and that was obviously part of his collection, along with the silk bindings and the jeweled bindings and the tortoise shell and the whatever, right? So there is a way where some collectors probably saw it as, oh yeah, well, yeah, I'll get that human skin book. That works perfectly for my collection, and not really thinking through what it is they're like, I am buying human remains here, you know? I think you see it on the oddities market too, where people are buying and selling in human remains. It's more, there are different laws around buying and selling of human remains, or even what constitutes a human remain, you know, between different countries. So it's really kind of, I do have a chapter where I dig into the like nitty gritty of that, but the collector kind of mindset, yes, is that you want to have the best, the rarest, the oldest, the, you know, best condition, you know, that kind of thing. And those fashions do change over time. I did mention things like people in book collectors in the 19th century used to routinely like unbind things and rebind them in new bindings. And, you know, I'm redoing my library and everything's going to have maroon Morocco binding. So I'm just taking all the original, you know, 17th century bindings off and putting in this new thing so they all look the same, you know, that kind of thing. No collector would do that now. But it is really interesting to think about the object in the way that the collector really, it really is like objectification in a very literal way. and the appeal of the object adds value to it. The scarcity adds value to it.
So because you have a background in medical librarianship, I can see how you would come upon the subject and be riveted. But was there a certain moment that happened for you? And could you tell us what the Anthropodermic Book Project, when it started and what it actually, like what it consists of? Because I think it's a good background into how you did your research and found these books.
Yeah, so I first came across the idea of human skin books when I was just visiting the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which is in my hometown. I love that place. It's a medical, historical medical museum, and they have the most unusual human remains on display all over the place, you know, thousands of bodies in a tiny little beautiful room. And then, yeah, it caught my eye that there were some very ordinary looking books with their covers closed in a glass case. And I was like, why would you show a book with its cover closed like this? Not even attractive looking. And then I read the description that it was books bound in human skin and that they were made by doctors. And it just kind of blew my mind and I got really interested. But I also thought that it was just a Mutter thing, like so many other things that only exist
like
at this place.
Like only there. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when I started, you know, when I was going to library school, it was an early iteration of going to library school online because I had to work full time. I couldn't just like not work. So I was working for a medical publishing company and then I was going to school. And I didn't really, at the time, they didn't have the ability to get into like the rare book track when you're doing remote work. So I've never gotten to have a solely only I do rare books job, just because it just didn't logistically work out that way. But I would take every opportunity I could to, you know, increase my education. And so if I was taking like a rare book cataloging course, and then I mentioned the things at the Mutter, and then this happens in the book, and then the teacher's like, oh yeah, I think we have one of those. And I'm like, what? You know, wait, you have one of those? And then as I started asking around, I would hear more and more, but it was a sort of almost game of telephone kind of situation where you had to know to ask. And then if someone was knowledgeable about the collection, they might know or have heard a rumor about a certain book, etc. So when I went to interview, I was working on an idea for a book, but it was kind of a different book. And I thought that I may cover human skin books as part of a larger, death objects in libraries and museums kind of situation. And as I went to interview the chemist who did the first tests, the first peptide mass fingerprinting tests on 3 alleged human skin books at Harvard. So when I went to talk to him, he started saying, well, have you heard about this one? Have you heard about that one? And I was like, well, have you heard about this one? It was just kind of chatting. And we had both been in contact with the director at the Mutter Museum, Anna Doty, who's a friend of mine. And, she had gotten in touch with the chemist to test their books. And it was all kind of just happening at the same time, just by coincidence. And so we decided to start comparing notes, and then it just kind of snowballed into this thing where let's keep track of it. Let's keep a database. Then I went back and got, data sharing forms from people to say, like, can we share your results? Yes or no. Let's try to get
an academic project. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's try to get a census here. But because we're interdisciplinary, because we're independent, we're not grant funded or anything like that. It's the sort of project that we do when we can. There are big ebbs and flows. Sometimes there's a whole lot of interest and we get a lot of emails and we follow them up. Sometimes
is there any cost and that's just floated by the chemist who does it in their time? They just volunteer it, or are you able to get funding for that specific part of it, or you just?
We have the people who want the test done pay for the lab fee. But we don't get paid and he doesn't get paid or anything like that.
And maybe it's good to mention that it's difficult to tell, like, just to give people background, it's extremely difficult. You can't tell without this kind of chemistry. Is that correct? There's no.
People like to say they can, but it's a lot more subjective than people would like to admit. So people say, oh, well, if you look at the pores, under a microscope, or, if you magnify it, you can see that if they're in a certain shape, that they're from a certain animal. Now that's like a rare book trade thing, right? Like if you were cataloging a book to sell, you may look at the leather and be like, okay, this is calf, or this is Morocco, right? Which is goat or whatever. And that is fine to do if you are generally, trying your level best to accurately describe a book that you're going to sell. If you mistake that, that is not the end of the world. But if you say something is human skin and it's not, or if you say something is not human skin and it is, there's a higher stakes involved. And so the test only really became available. It is a tried and true chemistry test that has been around for a long time, but it had only had this application to cultural artifacts around like 2014 or so. And so that's
presumably you have a lot of books that will pop up in your lifetime that you'll be testing.
Yeah, and objects. We've tested some objects, like I mentioned in the Nazi chapter that someone had come to us with an alleged Nazi human skin lamp, and it turned out to not even be an animal product. It was actually a paper, lampshade, like a cellulose. So it's, looks can be incredibly, and that lampshade looks like set dressing for a horror movie. It was like very repugnant looking, and you would definitely think
across very well.
It was a struggle to actually like describe it when it looks like there is something wrong with this. No person in their right mind would like buy this in a store or anything like that. And then it turned out not to be real. So looks can be absolutely deceiving. The reason that the test works is that leather really messes with the chemical makeup of like the leather tanning process is very chemically destructive, and it pretty much destroys the DNA that's available. And then, you know, these books are like 200 years old on top of it. So age degrades DNA, and any sort of condition like chemical processes or anything like that also really destroy the DNA. But our test tests the proteins, which are, you know, very hardy and last for like thousands and thousands of years.
We just
So
had a question about how much of the book has to be removed to test. And I imagine, well, you write about this in the book, but there are books that institutions have determined they will not test because they don't want any like process to be done on any part of the book.
Yeah, so some places, especially if you're looking at, say, the Bibliothèque Nationale, and you've got some alleged books that are from, you know, the 13th century, you know, manuscripts, they're not going to take anything off of those books ever. And I completely understand that. There, you know, sometimes depending on how old something is, or you know, that, or just the institution's rules, that there's like, we will not do this because it has to be technically destructive. But the piece that you would need to run the test is, if you can see it with your naked eye, then it is plenty big for running the test. You take this like teeny little tweezer nip off of, say, like the turn-ins on the corner or something like that, and then you dissolve it in an enzyme and run it through the machine. And then it also gets rid of any sort of touch DNA contamination. So previous tests that have tried to DNA test these books, there, or objects that are human skin, like the book The Lampshade, they found this alleged Nazi human skin lampshade in post-Katrina New Orleans. They took it to be DNA tested. In the book, it says that it was human. And then later they did a documentary series where they retraced the steps, and then the DNA testing had improved over that time, and they tested it and turned out that it was not human. But there had been human fingerprint, like human DNA touch contamination, that had given a false positive result. So you can't really get that in a peptide mass fingerprinting because it's dissolving the entire thing into, like, it would be very clear that like there's a huge amount of something, and even if there was a little bit of some other protein, you would know that that wasn't made of it. Like great ape.
I guess one of the other things that I'm trying to think of. So when I was reading the book, I think there are things that surprised me, and I'm interested in what surprised you. Like what in this process surprised you of hunting down on these books? Like where were you surprised? I think I was most surprised in the books bound in human skin that belonged to, that were written by Phyllis Wheatley, who's the first Black poet to publish a book in America. There are books by a woman, and there are several books by women or about women that have been bound in human skin. And also there's a lot of rumors around books by people of color saying this is bound in or owned by or from the skin of a person of color. And I thought this is really interesting. This is marginalized groups, especially in this time period. Why are these books popping up, by, you know, the ones with the rumors about them being bound? It was actually shocking to me. I wouldn't have guessed that any books by women were bound in human skin. It seemed, and I think you go through some ethical issues and very carefully talk about some of these things without wanting to judge too much, but maybe some of the issues around that you could share with us, because I think it is kind of, to me, that was the surprise of the book.
Yeah, so I wanted to be clear because some folks have read the book and gotten a little confused with the Phyllis Wheatley books, that those books are not bound in the skin of Phyllis Wheatley.
Right.
Some people think that they are definitely not. But there are at least two like known confirmed books. There was allegedly 3, and we have lost track. We, as like the world, have lost track of this 3rd book. They thought it was at Rutgers. It's not. And so that was actually my greatest archive dig, was that I with the help of the archivist at University of Mississippi, was able to find an invoice, which
That was amazing.
that was like my favorite find, because no one had found that, where there was an invoice to I always say it wrong, Zazendorf, very famous bookbinder, and that there was a invoice from the bookseller who got the Phillis Wheatley's Bound in Human Skin. And it was really late. It was like the 1930s, which is way later than most of these other things are happening. And the euphemisms used here, it was like using skin supply or leather supplied. So if you did not know the context, if you didn't know all the books, like if you didn't know about the books that existed, know who did it, knew where to send it, and then happened to find this thing and were able to interpret that, what that meant was that the bookseller had somehow furnished human skin for the binding of these books, and we still don't know where the skin came from for the creation of that book. So were those books multiple, and so that was like a really interesting kind of journey, like one where as I'm doing the research, I'm kind of like, afraid of what I was going to uncover. But in terms of people of color, the main thing that it was a surprise for me, I did not expect, was that thus far, the books that have said they are bound in the skin of blank race, if they mention race at all, or objects.
That it's a fraudulent claim.
Yeah, that they end up not being human skin. So what is it about the books that people have written in them that they're bound in human skin, and not only specifically human skin, but the skin of the Negro who died during the American Revolution, or the
That's
skin
about possessiveness of a person, which is really disturbing and awful.
And I also think that there's something there about maybe if people were trying to get one over on someone, that they thought the specificity of it would make it like more believable, where a lot of times the vast majority of these books do not say anything about the specific person who was used. Some of them mention that they are women. That is usually because they are binding a, say, medical book on midwifery or something like that, or a book that has something to do with like, sex in some regard. They're not really like sexy human skin books, but sort of more gender, I guess I would say. And the reason, there's 3 books. I go into it as much as I can. The books at the Muir Museum, because of work by, the former librarian there, Beth Lander, we're able to actually identify individuals for some of those books. So that is, those are the most, fruitful in terms of trying to get an idea of who the people were. But I do think that there is a tendency, given especially in the time and place that these were created, that the idea of someone being a woman or of another race or something is the exception, and that the default is white man, right? Like that's like the idea. However, a lot of people of color were overrepresented on doctors' slabs, in the anatomy labs, and that is where the skin was usually taken, was as a byproduct of the anatomical dissection process. So, and when skin is tanned, it can take any color, just like any other rare books that you see. When it's tanned in its natural state, it always defaults to like a lighter color, no matter what the outside layer looked like. When, so there's no way of looking at something and saying, oh, that was the skin of a Black person, for instance. So, and even if you look at like contemporary, and I get into this a little bit in the book as well, if you look at contemporary preserved tattooing, if you were a Black person with a tattoo and you got that process done, your preserved tattoo would look like it was on white skin. It's because of the layers of skin. And that's like kind of surprised. That was kind of surprising to me too. I just didn't know. So yeah, there's like a lot of, I wouldn't be surprised if a number of these books were people of color, but there's literally no way of knowing that. If there's no provenance attached to it, you cannot tell someone's race by DNA, really. That's like, even if we could DNA test the books, that's a big myth that people.
There's a whole colonial book collecting thing going on in that claim that I think is very present in other types of, you know, types of book material, rare books, maps, you know, the types of things that are super sought after in the trade often exoticize, you know, travel and of white people to foreign lands and the images of people of color. And they are they are highly sought after. And I feel like there is a place in this story that's really important, and why, you know, it's why I thought it was very interesting that there are some people in your field that are that really think these books should go away and be destroyed and are not valuable. Because I can see why they're could be seen as so harmful, if certain ones with certain histories could hold a certain amount of pain and be so inappropriate that, you know, I can see why a person would feel that way, but that's not your view. And I thought maybe you could speak to the ethics of retaining these books in libraries.
Sure. I think that the important thing to remember is that context is like everything. And there could be, you know, some books or some creations that are definitely like, okay, this is really terrible. And, you know, like, I think that people should, you know, that each institution should judge what they want to do or not do with their works based off of the actual facts that they are able to discern about the individual work, because there is a range, right, of these books, and also like the level to which you can know certain things. So you just shouldn't assume a certain intent or identity or anything like that without having like real actual historical proof to it. So I feel like some of the folks who are like, these books should just be destroyed, they are also kind of taking their 21st century view of what happened and their understandable emotional reaction to it, and then applying like a very broad brush, where I don't think that is often a good idea to do. So where I generally fall is the, you know, yes, the concept of consent didn't really exist. I think we only have one where there is understandable, you know, evidence that the person actually wanted this for themselves. But for the rest, we have no way of knowing. You can assume that someone probably wouldn't want this to happen to them.
This is how you can have a conversation around consent as a learning tool as well now.
Yes, yeah, the object kind of teaches you a whole lot about our history and understanding of consent, and this idea that we hold very dear today, and how it didn't even exist in a real way in the not that distant past. I mean, but also
we're still having that conversation. Institutions are still wading through it as well.
Right. Like, is it okay to have any human remains at all in a museum? Like that, like
that conversation is happening. Yeah.
Yeah. That kind of thing. But the way I look at it is that I believe that evidence of atrocities is important evidence to preserve, that we can't change what actually happened to these people, but the object can be used to teach about past atrocities. And we are very recently and continuously being able to explore these objects with new technologies and new lenses to learn more about them. And so if you destroyed them based off of sort of a half amount of evidence, or like a half-cocked idea of what happened, then you'll never be able to go back and learn the truth. So that is my argument for preservation, but I also understand why others would disagree with me on that.
That's great. We have quite a few questions and comments coming in, and I thought we should definitely like answer some of them. Everyone wants to know how many of these books are on your database list that are verified. So maybe we can, do you know the number off the top of your head?
I do. So so what the list is, and I'm actually hoping to expand this in the future whenever I get like a minute to myself. But what the list is a like confirmed we can find this physical object that exists and has this alleged, human skin provenance in a public collection of a library or museum or something like that. Of that, the number is still pretty much the same from when the book was discovered, which is like 50 books. And of those, we've managed to test like 31 of those books, and 18 were proven as human skin and 13 were other animals. However, we have also undertaken a number of object tests that kind of fall outside because it's not a book, but we've still done the test, or private collector books. And so it's the private collectors that email us like very consistently, and whether they actually then go forward with testing the books is like, we have done some tests, not a lot because of pandemic, that it hasn't really been as, there haven't been as many tests that are actually going on. There was a long time where we couldn't get in the lab, for instance. And a number of the testers are for private collections are in Europe. And so it's also a thing about people taking samples and sending them internationally, and then, the whole thing. So,
well, that can also be problematic with human remains, can't it? So,
right. If someone knew that teeny itty bitty little piece of leather was putative, human remain, I don't know what would happen coming from certain countries. Like, so the book has a couple of translations underway. And so I actually happen to have the Polish edition here, which is kind of cool. So that's
cool.
fun.
Yeah.
And also I love the author photo in the back because it's my regular photo, but I look like a Victorian ghost the way they did it. It's like very goth.
A piece of goth jewelry there.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
It's so funny. But so there's Polish, there's going to be Russian, there's going to be French, and I'm supposed to be going to France to promote the French translation in the spring, which is great. But the French laws around human remains, and even not just human remains, but like live bodies and what one can do with them, are the strictest that I've heard of in the world. Where it definitely was the case. I'm not sure if it still is, but even things like surrogacy were illegal in France. So what people do with cells and things like that are very, very strict. And I know that there have been auctions that were supposed to happen of human skin books that got canceled and things like that. So it'll be really interesting to see how it's like taken there. So if you were
I imagine that in every place that your book is published, that there will be people asking for you to test. You might get some interesting queries on books you haven't heard of.
Yeah, I'm also kind of like I'm kind of waiting to hear about, are there any that are from outside of that like Western tradition and maybe for completely different reasons?
Yeah, that would be really interesting.
Like, I wouldn't be surprised if, I've seen, say, like preserved tattoos of like full body Yakuza tattoos in Japan, for instance. Like, I've seen pictures of them, things like that in Southeast Asia, but has that ever actually translated into someone binding a book in human skin? I'm not sure.
The tattoo preserval, you do a nice job of showing that this is maybe a community who wouldn't mind that their skin was used in this way as a material, because they consider their skin a piece of art and artwork, and are going through a process of hoping to keep that art. That was really interesting. I hadn't given any thought to the possible person who would be happy to do that with their skin. Obviously, people donate their bodies to science all the time, and this is sort of different, but at the same time, really more relatable to that. It was really interesting and very, very. You're a member of the Order of the Good Death, which maybe you could just briefly mention in terms of how it informs your interests.
Yeah. So with the tattoos, it is interesting that there is not the squeamishness in general people have talked to about the idea of preserving one's tattoo that people have when they hear about books being bound in human skin. And I think the obvious main difference is consent, that these people very specifically would want that. And we have an idea, especially in America, that you should be able to do whatever you want, right? The laws have not caught up with our creativity around human remains. So there are a lot of outfits out there who are doing things that are not really explicitly sanctioned as legal in all 50 states or anything like that. So there's innovation happening, but the law doesn't catch up because it's complaint based. So someone would have to complain about what someone did for it to then be tested and codified in this way. So what's legal or not legal is not very cut and dried, but what is ethical or not ethical, or what's considered acceptable or not, is totally culturally relative. And I think that's something that really comes up, that I've learned a lot from the death positive movement, Order of the Good Death, is that so almost everything that we consider as this is the right way, this is the right thing to do with someone's body, this is the right way to grieve, this is the right way to do X, Y, or Z, that every single one of those things, there is a culture in a different time or place that does not agree with you on that being the right way. So that really set my mindset for trying to be open to learning about other ways and trying not to be too rigid in my concepts of stuff, and just trying to look at and understand and square things with my modern sensibilities, I guess.
We have a question from Margot she wants to know if you found any parchment human skin books, meaning the pages, each page is made many books are made of vellum or goat skin, the pages themselves. Have there been any where the pages are presumed to be human skin?
Good question. So I think, and I'm just trying to rifle through my memory, that there were definitely books that we tested that had parchment covers that were alleged human skin and turned out not to be human skin. I am not recalling one that has a parchment cover that actually was human skin. If there was a parchment cover of human skin, that is a candidate where you might actually be able to get DNA from it, because the parchment is not nearly as processed as leather. And there are some really interesting, I wrote an article about biocode ecology, studying books from using, various scientific methods, like the physicality of the books. And it's open access. I could probably find it and drop in the chat. But there are people doing a lot of interesting work on, say, on parchment and things like that, and learning things unbelievable stuff on the microgenomic level, kind of what's in there, because all of that stuff is actually present where it could not be in leather. So I know in terms of the parchment, the Ovid's Metamorphosis at Countway Library in Harvard was thought to be human skin, had a parchment cover, is usually sheep. When people think it's not, when people think it's human and it's not, it's usually sheep. I think there's something creepy looking about sheep skin that people tend oh, I can see some follicles and it's weird and this kind of gross color. Oh, good. Someone found the article. Thanks. And what was the other one? There was definitely another one that I just like saw or thought of that was a alleged parchment, or that was parchment but not. Oh, there was a grimoire, like a book of spells, of occult book at Brown University. They had the second largest confirmed human skin book collection at 4. The 5th one was one of those parchment creepy books with symbols and sigils and things, and that was not human.
What's the earliest book that you were able to confirm so far?
So that is a trickier question than one would think, because there's
because when it was found is different than when it was printed, right?
Right, exactly. So the date of publication of the text is separate from the actual age of the binding on the book. And
so
sometimes
the question would be, which binding is the earliest contemporary binding? That's the phrasing, I think, to the publishing of the book.
Well, I don't know if any of these are actually contemporary. They were all, built. I'm in my database right now trying to do this. So I'm looking at the
most of them are 19th century. Is there anything earlier than that?
Yeah, so the
19th.
my eyes are are scanning.
I'll look at some of the other questions.
Yeah, the earliest alleged human skin books, which I do not think are actually human skin books, are the 3 13th century Bibles at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. I do not think that those are real. There was a couple like late 15th, early 16th century books that were tested and are not real human skin. And then I think the earliest confirmed one we have is at Brown, and it's a Vesalius. So the text block was not the earliest Vesalius, but it was like a 1568 Vesalius bound in human skin in the 19th century.
Okay. So this is a really fairly modern phenomenon, except that you don't know because it's just what we have evidence of, right?
Yeah, and did anyone keep any notes about when the book was rebound? And so, I got a scholarship to Rare Book School for the history of bookbinding course, and then it got canceled for pandemic, and then it got postponed, blah, blah, blah. I'm hoping to go next year. That was something I couldn't do before I wrote the book, but I would like to be able to look at a book and be like, this is clearly rebound in the 19th century in France. But I do not have that like magic yet. So
someone will have it. Hopefully they'll share it, the magic. I certainly don't.
Yeah, it is a few hands hold those. Another early one that was proven bound in human skin that had that distinction that you mentioned of being a book written by a woman is the Louise Bourgeois, who was the French midwife, not the modern artist.
Yeah.
Her midwifery, like a midwifery book that she wrote, not the one she was most famous for, but this like sort of general home remedy book called Recueil de Secrets, is like the secrets, like a group of secrets or whatever. That was 1601, bound in 19th century, and we actually know that was bound in the skin of a woman named Mary Lynch. So
yeah, that was another really fascinating part of the book, actually. Kimberly wrote a lot of questions, many of which are a bit technical, and I'm wondering if some of them you might just want to chat about, but the how many do you have a queue? I guess she's asking if you have a queue of books that you're hoping to test at some point, or are you all caught up on your testing? And is there one particular that you're working on that you want to talk about? I mean, you do send them off to a chemist, a lab chemist who works with you, right? You take the sample and have to deliver it. Do you mail it or?
Yeah, so there's only one time that I have taken the sample physically myself, and that is like the beginning of the book. So you see me like going to this place locally, the wonderful Huntington Museum, Huntington Library in San Marino, California. Yeah. I take samples of a book and an object there, and that is the only time I've ever taken samples myself. Usually is the owner of the book, whether it's the library or private owner, we give them instructions for how to do it, and little test tube thing with a cap on it. You put it in there and you send it in the mail to the chemist, and then the chemist takes it to the lab. It's like the easiest way we've found to be able to do that. I do have a number of books that I wish we could test. Some of them could happen. Some of them seem like they'll probably never happen. Some people have expressly said no, never. And that's that kind of thing. I do mention them throughout the book, of those sort of white whale, like, I really wish I could know the truth about these books. About this
one photograph of one book in the book. I don't know if the paperback has more or not. But you mentioned why you selected that particular one. Did you want to mention which one that was?
Oh yeah, so that book is it's one of the 2 Dance of Deaths that are from Brown University. And I picked it because of its beautiful like treatment in terms of the way that they bound the book. There's gold skulls and knuckle bone crosses and little onyx bits and things like that. It's really, a nice piece of bookbinding art. And so I picked that one because it was one of the more interesting looking books, because most of them are very plain looking. So some are clearly like more rudimentary binding skills. Some of them are clearly well done, but usually really simply done. Might have a tiny little bit of gold tooling or something like that, but literally you would not be able to tell on your shelf that one, there was something different about it. And I think that's why, I get so many emails of people who's like, I have this book and it's weird looking. And then it's like, it's probably not, it's probably sheep. If you think it's creepy looking, it's probably a sheepskin.
There is a level of rare book dealing where you get a lot of questions like, this book is old. And you're like, yes, but guess what? There are a lot of old books. And that doesn't really mean, unfortunately, much, even if it's personal to you.
Yeah, it has to be super duper old for it to be like, it's like, oh, this book is old. It's from like, the 16th century. Yeah, okay. It doesn't matter if it's what it is. It's probably worth a decent amount of money, but that, people think old is like 1920 or something. It's just not the case in the field. So
yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think we've covered most of the questions, unless I'm missing anything.
Someone says it almost sounds as though this was as much an act of scholarly myth-busting as archival material and scientific investigation. Well,
that's a nice comment.
That is all yes, because so when you were talking about earlier, the nice compliment of that the book seems like very narrow in scope, but then it ends up being really broad ranging about a lot of things, including various book history elements. When I first thought about changing direction into, let me just focus on the human skin books and what I can find, because there is no book about this. There have been various articles over time in different places, but a lot of them are just rumors. And then there was this ability to actually test books that didn't exist before. And so all those things together made me think this is a worthwhile endeavor to pursue, because I want to know, and other people probably would too. But sometimes when you hear like, there's no book about this, maybe you should be the one to write it. That can be true, but also there might be a good reason that there's no book about this, which is that it covers like 200 years in many different countries and all these different disciplines, and you have to have
tons of myth busting, right? Or assumption busting.
Yeah, so you can't have like a very narrow focus. Like, I am a book historian and I cover like, Amsterdam from 1700 to 1750. You could not write that book, what I mean? So you'd have to be a more broad ranging like person, and that is not often valued in academia. I am an academic, but I knew once I started getting into this that this would not be an academic like monograph, that it would be commercial and wide ranging. And it just so happened that my magpie tendencies of being, I was a professional journalist before I was a librarian, and then being a librarian where you have to know a little bit about everything. And then
similar that way.
yeah, so the sort of my my broad ranging interests actually lent itself to this kind of investigation, where if you were a, you know, PhD in a certain area and that was your main focus, like this would not be a project you would ever like undertake. So.
Yeah. I think also you have to be up to the ethical thinking through the ethical dilemma of even just writing such a book with sensitivity, which I think you do very well. Obviously,
thank you.
People could write this book without that, and then it would be a problematic book.
Absolutely. And that was the most important thing to me. And it's been really gratifying that readers got it, because certain people, when they heard the idea or saw the pitch or whatever, did not get it and didn't think that it was like possible to do. And so the reviewers and the readers really got what I was going for, that it is a hard line to walk. And that's like the best compliment that I've gotten about the book, is that I do walk that line, that it is enjoyable. It's like a surprisingly enjoyable read, but that it's also very like ethical and sensitive. The way I threaded that needle was that I am a sort of character in the book because of all the timeline and different cities and stuff. But so anything that's funny that happens, it's me being an idiot, not, you know, I'm not making fun of anybody who had something happen to their body or anything like that, but it's just me being curious and a little goofy and a little klutzy, which are all real things that have happened.
Yeah, you've got people handing you like, here's a piece of human skin to look at, you know, and you weren't ready for it. So you have human reactions to those things.
Or ruining my shoes in the leather tannery, for instance. Like that's a scene that people
I think there's a really good mini doc if someone wants to quickly find it. I can't do it and talk at the same time. That was like made by like a small business project of like a credit card company or something. I could be making that up too, of your paper company or your parchment company. And it's really, really, I learned a lot. The only parchment company operating tannery for, you know, operating in the States, correct?
Mm-hmm.
It's worth watching if everyone wants. I think I posted it to the second.
I found it.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm not deft enough to Google things while I'm Zooming, but
right. So if anyone has like read the book and wondered what, you know, you can tell me if I captured it well enough, because the video is the same room, the same thing. You can really see it.
Really cool.
Yeah, it's really it was a huge, like, it was an amazing experience for me, and a real like challenging one in a certain way too, because, you know, I was vegan forever before, you know, and then to go from that to tromping around a leather tannery is a very interesting little quick journey.
Meaning to check it. So I went to the University of Virginia for undergrad, and they publish, they give you your diploma on vellum. And I remember being told, I don't really remember, but I remember being told we're like the only college or one of two colleges that does a vellum diploma. And like, it's supposed to be like so fancy to have that. And then thinking maybe they're the provider of that, you know, material, because I'm sure they get it in the States. I don't think they're importing it to give us our Thomas Jefferson diploma. So.
Yeah, it could very well be.
I've been meaning to check.
And it's UVA where I'll be going for.
I don't really care about diplomas on walls, but I thought it was interesting that it's very Virginia colonial history, Thomas Jefferson, to be like, and this is your diploma, the way that the original students got the diploma. But the tannery video is really, the doc is really great. It's really interesting to see how messy it is, and also how hard the work involved. And it gives you a sense of like, we're doing this because it's really important to preserve cultural book history. And, you know, I'm sure that they are a successful business, but it must be difficult. So.
Right. And it was really touch and go for them for a long time until they found this sort of way of collaborating with historians and librarians and scholars. And that's something that also really, I learned a lot in the process of researching this book, is that there, you know, like each book has all of these people associated with it that were involved in some way, either the creator of the text or the printer or the bookbinder or previous owners and institutions. And so if you have like a book, you have all these lines that go off of it. And so many of who was involved, they just like close off forever. There's never like a full provenance, like backstory of everyone who was involved in the creation of a book. And a lot of those processes of how one did a certain thing really get lost over time. And if people stop doing certain processes, then, you know, historians later then attempt to sort of reverse engineer how things got done, because, you know, something like making parchment, it is a trade that is like a dirty job, and that was passed down from generation to generation, apprentice, master to apprentice. And like a lot of those people maybe weren't even literate, but they didn't have to write things down. They would teach someone, you would learn how to do it and you would pass it along. Well, at some point that knowledge just goes away if the field goes away, or people caring about how certain things were done, or fashions change or whatever. So it is a really interesting, like, you know, there are a lot of mysteries still, I would say.
I liked your traveling through the book. That was really nice. We are out of time officially. We've gone a little over. So I'd like to thank you so much. I had the best chat, and I'm gonna ask Tiemann to take over and say goodbye to everybody. And I'm really happy we got to see you.
Thank you, Megan and Alison. It was really well, for indeed such a specific subject, a wide-ranging conversation, and the hour just flew by. So once again, thank you both for this well, very interesting conversation, and thank you for having this conversation at the American Book Center. Thank you all, the audience, for being here. Once again, the paperback will be available next month at our bookshop. And if you want to rewatch the video or share it with other people, it's on our YouTube channel. If you do, well, please leave a like on it, and you can rewatch it. And thank you all again, and goodbye, and hope to see you at another time next month with an ABC event.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.